The crowd erupted, some booing Kimmel, others egging him on. What happens when a legend's honor is dragged through the mud on live television? Clint Eastwood, the man whose steely gaze once tamed outlaws on screen, sat backstage, his weathered hands clenched into fists. At 85, he hadn't come to Jimmy Kimmel's glitzy Los Angeles studio for pleasantries. He'd come for war. Kimmel, the smug host with a grin sharp enough to cut glass, had spent weeks mocking Clint's latest Western, Dust and Valor, a film poured from the actor's soul. The movie honored the grit of forgotten ranchers, men like Clint's own father, who'd scraped a living from barren lands. But Kimmel called it a tired relic, a fossil of a bygone era. And worse, he'd sneered at Clint's age, his voice, even his walk, turning a man's legacy into a punchline. Tonight, Clint had enough. He demanded a spot on the show, not to promote, but to confront. The producer, a nervous man with sweat beading on his brow, tried to dissuade him. "Mr. Eastwood, it's live TV. Things can spiral." Clint's eyes narrowed. "Good. Let it." Now, as the theme music blared and the crowd roared, Clint strode onto the stage, uninvited, his boots heavy on the polished floor. Kimmel's smile froze, a crack in his polished mask. "Well, folks, looks like we got a surprise guest," he said, voice dripping with forced charm. The audience clapped, unaware of the storm brewing. Clint didn't sit. He stood, towering, his voice low and gravelly. "You got a big mouth, Jimmy. Been running it about my work, my life. You think you're clever, tearing down what you don't. Understand?" The crowd hushed, sensing the edge in his words. Kimmel leaned back, smirking, but his eyes darted nervously. "Come on, Clint, it's just jokes. You're a legend, you can take it." Clint stepped closer, his shadow falling over the desk. "Jokes? You call mocking a man's heart and soul a joke? You sit there grinning like a snake, while real folks, the ones I made that film for, get spit on by your kind." The audience gasped, some cheering, others frozen. Kimmel's face tightened, his charm slipping. "Hey, old man, this is my show. You don't like it, change the channel." Clint's jaw clenched, his voice a growl. "Your show? It's a circus, and you're the clown. You don't know the first thing about struggle, about respect." Kimmel shot to his feet, his voice sharp. "Respect? You barge in here acting like you own the place and demand respect? You're out of touch, Eastwood. Your movies, your whole tough guy act, it's ancient history." The crowd erupted, some booing Kimmel, others egging him on. Clint didn't flinch, his eyes locked on the host. "Ancient? Maybe. But I've lived a life you couldn't survive a day of. You want to talk tough? Say it to my face, not behind a desk." Kimmel laughed, but it was hollow, his confidence fraying. He leaned forward, voice venomous. "You're a has-been, Clint. Nobody cares about your dusty cowboys anymore. Go back to your ranch and leave the real world to us." The audience roared, split between shock and thrill. Clint's fists tightened, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You're gonna regret that, boy." The tension was a live wire, the air thick with the promise of chaos. Kimmel, sensing the crowd's shift, tried to pivot, gesturing to the band. "Let's take a break, folks." But Clint wasn't done. He stepped closer, his presence a wall, and the show cut to commercial with the host's smirk, faltering under the weight of a legend's wrath. The commercial break did nothing to cool the fire raging on Jimmy Kimmel's stage. Clint Eastwood stood like a monument, his eyes burning into the host, who fumbled with his note cards as the show snapped back to life. The audience, still buzzing from the clash, leaned forward, their cheers and murmurs a restless tide. Kimmel, desperate to claw back control, forced a laugh, but it cracked under the weight of Clint's unyielding stare. "All right, folks, let's calm this down," Kimmel said, his voice thin, betraying a flicker of panic. "Clint, you've made your point. Why don't you sit? Tell us about your movie." Clint didn't move, his boots rooted to the stage. "I didn't come to chat, Jimmy. I came to set you straight. You think you can sling mud at my work, at me, and hide behind your cheap suit and fake laugh?" The crowd roared, some shouting Clint's name, others jeering Kimmel. The host's face reddened, his smirk twisting into a scowl. "You're embarrassing yourself, Eastwood. This is a talk show, not a saloon. You gonna draw a pistol next?" The jab landed like a spark in dry grass, and Clint stepped closer, his voice a low, searing growl. "Keep talking, city boy. You're the one hiding, tossing insults from your shiny desk like a coward. Say it plain. You think I'm done, that my life's work is trash." Kimmel stood again, his hands slamming on the desk, voice rising to a snarl. "Fine. You want plain? Your movie's a snooze, Clint. It's old, slow, and nobody wants it. Just like you. You're a relic stomping in here like you still matter." Gasps ripped through the audience, followed by boos aimed at Kimmel. A woman in the front row yelled, "Shame on you, Jimmy!" Clint's lips twitched, not a smile, but a predator's grimace. "Matter? I've got more truth in one frame of that film than you've got in your whole career. You mock ranchers, farmers, folks who break their backs for nothing, while you sit here peddling garbage and calling it entertainment." Kimmel's eyes flashed with fury, his voice cutting like a blade. "Oh, spare me the noble cowboy act. You're just mad because the world moved on, and you're stuck in the dust. You can't handle a little criticism, so you storm in here throwing a tantrum." The crowd erupted, split between cheers for Clint's defiance and shouts egging on the fight. Clint leaned in, his voice steady but laced with venom. "Criticism? You don't criticize. You destroy. You tear down anything good because it makes your empty little world look smaller." Kimmel laughed, sharp and cruel, stepping around the desk to face Clint. Closer now, their heights mismatched, but the hostility electric. "Empty? I've got millions watching me every night. You? You're lucky if your movie fills a theater. Face it, old man, you're irrelevant." The word hung in the air, a gauntlet thrown. Clint's hand twitched, not for a weapon, but as if gripping the rage he held back. "Irrelevant? I've lived through wars, loss, and betrayal, and still built something real. You're a vulture, picking at scraps of other people's lives." The audience was a volcano, their shouts shaking the stage. Kimmel, cornered, jabbed a finger at Clint. "Get off my stage, Eastwood. You're done here." Clint didn't budge, his voice a quiet, deadly promise. "I'm not done till you learn respect or I make you." The producers signaled frantically from the wings, but the show was a runaway train, and neither man would yield. The stage was a battlefield, and neither Clint Eastwood nor Jimmy Kimmel would back down. The audience, a roaring sea of cheers and jeers, fueled the chaos as the two men stood inches apart. Kimmel's fingers still jabbed toward Clint, his face twisted with defiance. "You heard me, Eastwood. Get out!" Kimmel spat, his voice shrill with the desperation of a man losing his grip. Clint's eyes, cold as a winter desert, didn't waver. "You don't tell me to leave, Jimmy. Not after you've spent months carving up my name for laughs. You want to talk about done? Look in the mirror." The crowd exploded, some chanting, "Clint! Clint!" while others hurled insults at Kimmel. A man in the back shouted, "You're a bully, Jimmy!" The host's jaw tightened, his control slipping, like sand through his fingers. He turned to the audience, arms spread, voice dripping with sarcasm. "Oh, you love this guy? This washed-up cowboy who thinks he's still king? He's nothing but a grumpy old man yelling at clouds." The boos rained down, louder now, the crowd turning on their once-favored host. Clint stepped forward, closing the gap, his voice a low, cutting blade. "You call me old, but I've got more fight in me than you'll ever know. You pick on people's dreams, their sweat, because it's easy. You're weak, Jimmy." "A small man with a big stage." Kimmel's face flushed, his hands balling into fists. Weak? I built this show from nothing. You think you can waltz in, play the hero, and steal my spotlight? You're pathetic. The words were a spark to dynamite, and the audience gasped as Clint's hand shot up, not to strike, but to point, his finger inches from Kimmel's chest. Your spotlight? It's built on lies. You twist stories, mock honest work, and call it comedy. You've got no spine, just a mouth that never stops. Kimmel swatted Clint's hand away, his voice a snarl. Don't you dare touch me, you fossil. You think you're tough because you played a gunslinger? This is my world, and you're just a guest who overstayed his welcome. The crowd was on its feet, the air thick with tension, every word a fresh wound. Clint's voice dropped, steady but molten. Your world? It's a house of cards, and I'm the wind. You mocked my film, my people, because you're scared. Scared of anything real, anything that shows you up for the fraud you are. Kimmel laughed, but it was brittle, his eyes darting to the producer, who was now pleading with the crew to cut to commercial. Fraud? You're the one living in a fantasy. Eastwood. Your movies are dead. Your fans are dying, and you're too stubborn to see it. The audience roared in protest, a woman yelling, You're wrong, Jimmy! Clint's a hero! Clint seized the moment, turning to the crowd, his voice ringing clear. This man laughs at your lives, your struggles. He calls your stories boring, because he's never lived one worth telling. The cheers were deafening, a tide lifting Clint and drowning Kimmel. The host, cornered, lunged forward, his voice a venomous hiss. You don't get to preach here. I'm the star, not you. Clint didn't flinch, his presence a wall. Star? You're a spark that's already fading. Keep pushing, Jimmy, and I'll show you what a real fight looks like. The producer rushed onto the stage, arms waving, shouting for a break, but the crowd's roar drowned him out, and the cameras stayed locked on the two men, their war far from over. The producers' frantic pleas were swallowed by the audience's thunder, their cheers and boos a living pulse that shook the stage. Clint Eastwood stood unmoved, his gaze a steel trap locked on Jimmy Kimmel, who trembled with rage, his polished facade shattered. The cameras, unyielding, captured every bead of sweat on the host's brow as he glared at the legend before him. You think you can turn my own crowd against me? Kimmel snarled, his voice raw, almost breaking. This is my house, Eastwood, and you're nothing but a trespasser. Clint's eyes glinted, his voice steady, slicing through the noise. Your house? You built it on the backs of people you mock. You call their lives small, their work worthless, because you're too scared to face your own emptiness. The crowd erupted, their shouts a wave crashing over Kimmel, who flinched as if struck. A man in the audience yelled, Tell him, Clint! He's a fake! Kimmel spun toward the voice, his finger jabbing at the crowd. Shut up. You think this guy's your savior? He's a tired old man chasing glory that's long gone. The boos were instant, a chorus of disgust, but Kimmel doubled down, turning back to Clint, his voice a venomous hiss. You're not a hero. You're a joke, Eastwood, and I'm the one who gets to laugh last. Clint stepped closer, his shadow, swallowing Kimmel's slight frame, his words slow and deliberate. Laugh? You're shaking, boy. You know why? Because deep down you see what I see. A man who's got nothing but a loud mouth and a borrowed stage. The audience roared, their loyalty now firmly with Clint, their jeers a blade at Kimmel's throat. The host's face twisted, his voice rising to a desperate shout. Borrowed? I earned this. You're the one clinging to a past nobody cares about. Your ranchers, your dusty trails, they're dead, and you're too blind to bury them. Clint's fists clenched, his voice dropping to a dangerous rumble. Dead? Those people feed this country, keep it standing, while you spit on their graves for a cheap chuckle. You're not just a coward, Jimmy. You're a traitor to everything real. The word traitor hit like a gunshot, The crowd gasping, then cheering wildly, a woman shouting, "You tell him, Clint!" Kimmel, cornered, lunged forward, his face inches from Clint's, his voice a snarl. "You don't scare me, old man. You're all talk, no fight. Take a swing, I dare you." Clint didn't move, but his eyes burned with a fire that made Kimmel step back, doubt flickering in his gaze. "I don't need fists to break you," Clint said, his voice a quiet storm. "You're already crumbling. Look at you, begging for control, while your own people turn their backs." The crowd's cheers were deafening, a tidal wave of support for Clint, their voices chanting his name. Kimmel's hands shook, his voice cracking as he tried to rally. "You think you've won? This is my show, my rules. You'll never outshine me." But the words were hollow, his confidence a fading echo. Clint leaned in, his voice a final, searing blow. "You're not shining, Jimmy. You're burning out, and I'm here to watch it happen." The audience was a frenzy, their roar a verdict, and Kimmel stood frozen, his empire of laughs collapsing under the weight of a legend's truth. The stage was a crucible, and Jimmy Kimmel stood at its center, his empire of laughter reduced to ashes. The audience, now a unified force behind Clint Eastwood, chanted his name, their voices a relentless drumbeat that drowned out the host's fading bravado. Kimmel's eyes darted, wild with the realization that his control had slipped beyond recall. "You think you've got them?" he shouted, his voice hoarse, a last gasp of defiance aimed at Clint. "They'll forget you by tomorrow, Eastwood. You're nothing without your old movies." Clint stood tall, his weathered face carved with resolve, his voice a deep, unyielding tide. "Forget me? Maybe. But they'll remember this. The night a small man got taught a big lesson." The crowd roared, their cheers a thunderclap, a woman in the front row shouting, "You're the man, Clint!" Kimmel's face contorted, his hands gripping the desk as if it could anchor him. "Lesson? You're delusional. This is my stage, my crowd. You can't take that from me." But his words were frail, a crumbling wall against the audience's scorn. Clint stepped forward, his presence a quiet, unshakable force. "I didn't take anything, Jimmy. You lost it. You mocked honest folks, their lives, their pain, and thought you'd get away with it. But truth cuts deeper than your jokes." The boos aimed at Kimmel were a storm, the crowd's anger a mirror of Clint's own. A man yelled, "You're finished, Jimmy!" The host spun toward the voice, his voice a desperate snarl. "I'm not finished. I'm Jimmy Kimmel. You need me." But the crowd's jeers only grew, their rejection a blade that pierced his pride. Clint's voice cut through, calm but razor-sharp. "Need you? They need men who respect their struggle, not mock it. You've got no place in their hearts anymore." Kimmel staggered back, his face pale, the weight of his defeat sinking in. You can't do this to me," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. Clint leaned in, his words a final verdict. "I didn't do it. You did. You built a throne on lies, and now it's gone." The audience erupted, their applause a tidal wave chanting, "Clint! Clint!" As Kimmel sank into his chair, his head bowed, a king dethroned. Clint turned to the crowd, his eyes softening for the first time, his voice steady but warm. "This ain't about me. It's about you, the folks who work, fight, and keep this world turning. Don't let anyone tell you your story don't matter." The cheers were deafening, a celebration of shared victory, as Clint gave a single nod and walked off the stage, his boots echoing with purpose. The cameras followed, him, leaving Kimmel alone, a shadow of the man who'd started the night. The producer, stunned, signaled the end of the show, but the audience kept cheering, their voices carrying Clint's triumph beyond the studio walls. Kimmel stared at the empty stage, his smirk gone, his legacy undone by a legend who'd spoken for the forgotten. The night belonged to Clint, a man who'd faced a giant and walked away taller, his truth a flame that would burn in the hearts of those who'd witnessed it.